He's the man who engineered the right-wing takeover of the courts. He's sitting on a $1.6 billion slush fund, and now he says he's coming for the rest of American politics and culture. I'm Matt Robeson. I'm not that guy, and I host Beyond Politics. We're available wherever you get your podcasts, and of course on the Blue Amp channel. And I am delighted to once again welcome back one of the outstanding team of journalists at ProPublica who do so much amazing investigative work. And it's always just a thrill and a voyage of discovery to have one of these team folks on the show. And today we've got Andy Kroll, who's an investigative reporter for ProPublica, where he covers voting, elections, the courts, and other democracy issues. He's also the author of the book, A Death on W Street, The Murder of Seth Rich and the Age of Conspiracy. And Andy is fresh off of reporting, along with a couple of colleagues, a fascinating deep dive into the man whose name I withheld from you at the outset, Leonard Leo, who may be the most important figure that you might have heard of in American politics. Andy Kroll, welcome to Beyond Politics.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I am really happy to have you. I wish we were not talking about this guy. He is fascinating. I will give you that. And you and I were talking before we got on the air about how hard it is with such a sprawling story like you have reported out. And I have to say, it is evident reading this, just how much work you have put into really capturing not just like the records details, but the visual details, the stories that go behind the saga of this man who has engineered profound changes in American society through his stranglehold on the right-wing architecture of putting right-wing figures onto the courts. How would you sum up, for people who maybe heard about Leonard Leo, what the story is here?
I like to say that Leonard Leo is the most influential person in American politics over the last 40 years that you most likely have not heard of. He is someone who has operated just beyond the sort of television camera frame, just beyond the columns in the New York Times, someone who is hugely influential, who has had a hand in nominating or confirming all 6 of the conservative justices now on the Supreme Court, and someone who can really say that his legacy is this court and what it is doing in terms of its decisions touching every part of American life. And yet, amazingly, his influence on the Supreme Court is just one piece of the puzzle. It is not the start and the end of his role and of his influence. It's really just one part of what Leonard Leo, a name that people love to hear because they can't believe his name is actually Leonard Leo. It's just one sort of element of his influence. And when we set out to do this project, as I just mentioned to you a second ago before we started taping, we approached Leonard Leo in a way that Robert Caro approached Robert Moses in his magisterial book, The Power Broker, so many decades ago. We approached Leo in that way because we believe that in the ways Robert Moses, an unelected, not particularly famous, behind the scenes power broker in New York City, operated, Leonard Leo, someone who's never been elected to higher office, never been a judge, never tried a case in court, has exerted a huge influence, not just the courts in America, but in the direction of American society.
It's a wonderful comparison you're making. And actually, once you made it, it was like a head-slapping aha moment for me. Robert Moses, who never held a position higher than state parks commissioner, I believe, in New York State, and yet literally was the architect of the greatest city on earth. I mean, vying with, I don't know, Beijing and whatever, but that's the kind of figure, that's influence. And they operate in the same way. It's behind the scenes, and it's really digging into the details. The key, Carol points out, to Moses's dark genius was he showed up to all the meetings. He read every darn page, and he always volunteered. I'll take the notes. I'll write the minutes. I'll write the details. And what comes through so clearly in your piece is that Leonard Leo is cut from the same cloth. Take us back a little bit. It felt to me like what you were suggesting is While Leonard Leo was born in the 60s, he's really a creature of the late 80s. He is a creature of these bruising judicial fights that came with Robert Bork, the disappointment of the right and the failure of the nomination of Robert Bork, the bruising political battle over Clarence Thomas, and then the Planned Parenthood versus Casey decision, this string in about 6 years of watershed moments that really launched him. Is that read right?
Yeah, no, that read is absolutely spot on. There are really, when you're writing a portrait of power, which is what we set out to do here, you look for those inflection points, those seminal moments that shaped your subject's view of politics, view of the legal system, a view of the world around them. And with Leonard Leo, it was very clear that there were those 2, 3, 4 moments in the basically, I'd say mid 1992, which is the Casey decision, where you really have this formative period for him. And it's these massive events that maybe listeners of the podcast will know in a sort of broader sense, but we see them through the eyes of our subject, Leonard Leo. And with the Bork defeat, when Robert Bork, the obviously controversial figure in the Nixon years with the Saturday Night Massacre, but then goes on to become this sort of titan in the conservative legal world, because Bork and Scalia are the ones who pioneer this legal idea of originalism. We can only interpret the Constitution the way the founders wrote it at the time and what they intended at the time, and nothing more. So Bork is, in Leonard Leo's world, he is an icon, a giant, an intellectual hero. And when Bork is effectively humiliated when he's defeated as a Supreme Court nominee put up by Reagan, that is a scarring moment for people like Leo, but it is also a formative moment where they start to change their thinking and their approach about how these judicial battles, especially Supreme Court nomination battles, are waged. Clarence Thomas in 91, for which Leo had a front row seat. He was working on the Thomas confirmation team, very young at the time, 25 years old. Imagine being 25 and being in the middle of that battle. Obviously, that has a huge effect on Leo. And then the Casey case is really interesting. I'm glad you brought it up. This is in 92. Supreme Court rules 5-4, essentially upholding Roe v. Wade, in this case, Planned Parenthood, Pennsylvania v. Casey. But what makes this decision so infuriating for conservatives is that the 3 judges who co-wrote the majority opinion, Sandra Day O'Connor, Anthony Kennedy, and David Souter, are all Republican appointees, all put on the bench by Republican presidents. It is from this decision, in this moment, Leo especially has an understanding, comes to a realization that they can't just elect Republican presidents and let the president pick who they want to pick for the Supreme Court and expect that person to uphold conservative ideals, to be loyal to the cause. They're going to have to cultivate, train, mentor, guide, and propel along their own conservative jurists, their future Scalias, their future Clarence Thomases, basically from law school all the way to the end of their life, or at least until they get on the bench. So this is a really key period. And I loved digging into the archives for this. I loved looking for those key moments that shaped how Leo then spent the next 30 years of his life.
You do, it seems, and this is me reading between the lines of you reading between the lines, but it felt
Yeah.
to me like I could almost picture you in a very Robert Caro kind of way, trying to put yourself into the mindset of this fascinating guy. Say what you will about him, and I have plenty I could say if I were off editorializing. He is fascinating. It did seem like there was this 3-step process. The first realization around the Bork hearing was, whoa, the game has changed. This is a political battle.
Yes.
Step
Yes.
2 was the Thomas nomination, which is, if we're going to win this, we're going to get down in the muck and we're going to win this.
Yep.
We're going to fight hard. We're going to fight dirty, and we're going to gut and grit our way through. And then, as you say, there's the Planned Parenthood decision, which is, you know what? We've got to, it's like the line from The Untouchables. If you're worried about getting a bad apple, don't take it from the barrel, go to the tree. And Leonard Leo
I love
develops
that. I
this
wish I'd thought of
insight.
that. Jeez.
We'll workshop your next story together.
Yes, I will.
And Leonard Leo seems to, at that moment, realize, okay, we are going to start from the ground level. And this is a 30-year, we're going to play the long game. This is a 30-year project. And that culminates in Dobbs and so much more. Let's talk a little bit about that 90s period into the 2000s. It's interesting because Leonard Leo, at this point, as you say, during the Thomas nomination, he's still young. He's in the middle of it, but he's a relatively minor figure. He's not a heavy hitter.
Right.
And he makes this decision. He could take a law firm job, or he could go to the Federalist Society. And he seems to have the insight. It's like the movie The Right Stuff. Do you know what makes these rocket ships go up? Funding. And he decides he is going to be the money man, which was something that went back. You found in his high school yearbook. He was always the money bags guy, right?
Moneybags Kid was his nickname in high school.
The Moneybags Kid. So he is going to be the guy who has access to the money. That's step one. And then he emerges in the George W. Bush White House as, again, he's still a minor player, but he seems to realize he is going to always be in the room. He is always going to show up. And it's just like Robert Moses. He's going to be writing the notes. He's going to be present, and he is going to get his hand on the tiller somehow. That's what came across to me.
Yeah, no, that's spot on. And it actually calling back to your description of Robert Moses as told by Robert Caro, someone who always showed up, always took the notes, was always at the meetings. We interviewed Steve Schmidt, the well-known, I don't know if he's a Republican consultant anymore.
He ain't anymore.
No, yeah, Lincoln Project. Not quite sure where Steve is at these days. But in the mid 2000s, Steve Schmidt was working in the White House, and he was the lead Bush White House aide for the judicial confirmation battles when the Supreme Court openings came up. Now, remember, Bush didn't get any openings in his first 4 years. And then all of a sudden in 2005, he had two. And there was really a rush to try to get the right people in place to try to not make the mistakes of the Reagan White House, where a lot of people felt that the Reagan White House was unprepared for the attacks on Bork, hung him out to dry. Thomas obviously squeaks by barely. Narrowest margin for a Supreme Court confirmation vote in 100 years for Thomas. But what Schmidt told us is just like what Carol said of Moses, which is Schmidt had a quote basically, if you think of these Supreme Court confirmation campaigns as like a PTA meeting, take it all the way down to the PTA meeting. Who is the person who ends up in charge and leading the way? It's the person who shows up to all the meetings. And that was Leonard Leo. This is what Schmidt told us. There's one little story as well. It didn't make it into the piece, but I always thought was revealing as well about Leo, which was in 2004, I believe, there was a guy named Diehl Hudson, an influential activist in the conservative Catholic world, editor of Crisis Magazine, which was a big magazine for the Catholic community. Diehl Hudson worked closely with Karl Rove as the sort of Catholic liaison to the Bush White House. And the Bush White House really tried to win back conservative Catholics in 2000. So I guess it would have been the Bush campaign in 2000, and then again in 2004. And then in 2004, this guy, Diehl Hudson, gets wrapped up in a personal scandal, has to resign, cannot stay in his role connected to the Bush White House. And I talked to Diehl Hudson for this story, and he said that after he announced his resignation, leading the Catholic Working Group is what it was called, the first person to call him was Leonard Leo. And Leonard Leo said, I want to take over your role. You're leaving. I want the role. I want to take it. And it wasn't like, so sorry to hear about your scandal, or like, how are you doing? It was like, who's taking your role at the Catholic Working Group? I want it. And he got it. And when I talked to Diehl Hudson about this almost 20 years later, he said, it's like, I kind of admire the hustle. His first thing he did was call me and say, I want that role. And so Leo really worked his way, muscled his way, or outlasted his way into these influential positions. And then once he has these influential positions, once he's seen as someone who is close to President Bush, close to two Supreme Court justices that he helps confirm in John Roberts and then Samuel Alito, once he is high up at the Federalist Society, which he was by the 2000s because he'd been there at that point for more than a decade, he also becomes this figure of influence in the donor world. This is really key. It's around the late 90s, 2000s, where Leonard Leo is not just some mid-level or mid to high-level director at this little legal group, the Federalist Society. He's someone who has been in the Oval Office. is connected with the White House top aides, is worked on the Roberts campaign, worked on the Alito campaign, worked on the 2004 Bush reelection campaign when he said to Deal Hudson, I want your job. Deal Hudson said, okay. So he really starts to straddle all of these different worlds. And that also brings him into contact with all these big money donors.
Right. If there is something we could learn, if there are young people out there who perhaps are considering a career in the dark arts or maybe want to do good, I that stood out to me, as well as the quote that you have later from the Reverend Rob
Shank,
who said of his own kind of cozying up to figures of power in the right-wing judicial orbit. He said, I know how much it benefited me to say to donors, I was with Justice Scalia last night or last week, or I had a lovely visit with Justice Chum. Anybody can try and get change at the Supreme Court by filing an amicus brief, almost anybody, but how many people can get into chambers, or better yet, into a justice's home? You can almost see in the narrative that you just laid out the cunning genius of what Leonard Leo pulled off. Not that it wasn't legitimate at some level, but it seemed like he was playing a two-sided shell game where on the one hand, he was doing the dirty work in the 90s for the Federal Society. He quadrupled their fundraising. He was legit raising dollars for that group. And on the other hand, he was worming his way into these rooms of power and being in the room, in the mix, when these decisions were being made. And then he could basically play a game of telephone between those two sides. He could go back to the donors and say, I have access. I was with the president yesterday talking about this decision. And when he's in the room, he can say, I have the resources of the base. And you lay this out, you hint at it a little bit in the failed nomination of Harriet Miers, President George W. Bush's counsel at the time. She was trotted out as the nominee. The right had a meh, no, please don't do this, Mr. President, reaction to that. And Leonard Leo seemed to be the conduit for this. And he was then able to turn around and with the replacement nominee, which was Alito, I believe, to bring to bear all of these massive resources, leveraging the lessons he learned during the Clarence Thomas nomination of we are going to treat this as a political campaign. We're going to put the funding into it. We're going to run ads. We're going to gin up the base. We're going to make this a political thing. At that point in the mid-2000s, his position of power was cemented. He had both sides working. He had access to the money, and he was able to use that money to get the results that the president wanted, and he was launched.
He filled a role that no one has ever held before, and I don't think anyone has held since. Obviously, on the conservative side, he is the guy, and there really isn't someone like this on the liberal side, as far as I can tell. And we've certainly tried to do our due diligence and figure this out. But we also talked to historians of the Supreme Court, historians of American jurisprudence, and asked them, is there a precedent for Leonard Leo? And it was an interesting question for them because as far as I could tell, they'd never been asked this before, but they could not think of someone who checked all these boxes that he did, who filled this very sort of singular, almost hard to define role that straddles politics and the courts and the big money. And then that's what made him so fascinating to us. And you brought up Reverend Schenck. He's an evangelical Protestant minister, was for a long time a leading figure in the religious right, especially on anti-abortion, and then the public displays of religion, like big crusader for you should have the 10 Commandments outside City Hall and you can't ban us from doing that kind of thing. And then around the Trump campaign in 15 and 16, seeing his evangelical comrades lining up eventually behind Donald Trump, thanks in part to Leonard Leo's help. Schenck has this sort of come to Jesus moment, for lack of a better way to put it. He's also reading Bonhoeffer at the time and thinking about Germany in the 1930s and decides that he's not going to associate himself with these people. But he had this great front row view to Leo during this period we're talking about, the 2000s. And he described him as a philosopher general. That's something else that didn't quite make it into the piece, sadly. As this guy who, when you were in a different part of the conservative movement and you heard that Leonard Leo was getting involved, or that in the case of Trump in 15, Leonard Leo is going to be, or I guess in 16, technically, Leonard Leo is going to be helping Trump on judges. It was like the ultimate sign of validation
The
We're like,
good housekeeping seal of
yeah,
approval.
yeah, okay, yeah, okay. If Leonard Leo and the Federalist Society are getting involved, then we know we're in good hands. Leonard Leo is dealing with the judges. He's got us covered. We can hold our noses and vote for this guy or donate to him or whatever. And there's just no one else who fills that role. There's no one else who has that kind of imprimatur or that reputation
Right.
that Leo does, especially by the time we're talking about now, 2000s, 2010s.
It does seem to have this genius for myth making in a
Hmm.
very, it's like the movie This Is Spinal Tap. It's not like his popularity is limited, it's that he's playing to a selective audience, right? And
Yeah.
this is a guy who is very famous and has a mythical quality to him to a selected audience. As you were saying at the top, he's not a household name. He's not
Yeah.
someone who's bandied about in the news. He's well known in on this show. I've talked to Senator Sheldon Whitehouse about him a couple of
Oh,
times.
yes.
Believe me, power players know who the heck he is. And he seems to have kind of, through these mechanisms, through he has access to the money, he has access to the rooms, he's able to drive these outside political campaigns, and he begins to develop a reputation. It's a little bit of admiration. It's a little bit of fear. And
Hmm.
we begin to see in your narrative, and by the way, I'm just giving the tip of the iceberg here in this show. I want people to read the piece. It's worth it. It's a little bit like the experience in miniature of reading The Power Broker. I do want people to get all of the vignettes, but this picture begins to emerge in your story toward the end of the 2010s of kind of everything we've seen in the last decade is now in full blossom with him. He is overseeing a network of organizations that are affiliated. In some cases, this is something we've gone over with Senator Whitehouse. In some cases, they're different legal entities that are on the same hallway in the same building, and they're the same thing. They're the same thing, except they're different legal entities, and they're moving money around in ways that, even with all of your investigative reporting skills, we still can't fully track. We don't know where all of it's going to and coming from.
Hmm.
And he's also beginning to operate more boldly as a power player behind the scenes. You tell this amazing anecdote about a pressure campaign that he put on Matt Blunt. Take us through that. What happened there?